Hey friends, welcome back to the channel. My name is Liad. This week, I'm going to try and do this recording without writing the script first. I will edit this to get rid of all my ums and also the large spaces in between thoughts, and also to get rid of when I repeat myself, because I will also do that. But I'm going to give this a try and see if it's easier and quicker than writing a script, because speed is a big issue I have with making these videos. Anyways, this week it's all about my primary palette. For those who don't know, I use a modified CMYK palette. Before we get into my palette specifically, what is a CMYK palette and what is an RGB palette and all that, and what is a primary palette overall? Regardless of which palette you're using, a primary palette is a palette comprised of colors that make up your primary colors. Yes, I know that's self-explanatory, but what a primary color actually means is that it's a color that you can't mix. You can mix other colors with it, but you cannot mix that color. That's an important distinction, because there are colors that you can't mix, but they're still not primary. For instance, with a normal primary palette, regardless of what it is, you can't mix neon pink. But neon pink is not a primary color unless you're doing a neon palette. Then maybe it is. I'd have to test it. Probably not, but maybe. But regardless, it's not a primary color in normal palettes, because even though you can't mix it, you can't use it to mix your other colors. That's the basics of a primary palette. So the primary palette that most people know is RBY, red, blue, and yellow. It's very, very flawed. In light, primary palette is RGB, which I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with. It's also how screens are built. They're made with little RGB light. They're so small and tightly packed, they give the illusion of all the colors that our screens produce. But RGB is an additive color system, which means when you add all the colors together, you get white. It's light, so the more light you put into it, the brighter it gets. A subtractive system is one where the more color you add, the darker it gets. And that's what CMYK is considered to be. Doing this without a script might mess me up a little bit. You'll see how ADHD I am. But I will put a link to a creator, Peter something, I can't remember his name. I will find the link for it. He does color science and light science related stuff. Really, really good. I really like him. Anyways, so CMYK color palette, a lot of people know it from printing, is considered a subtractive color palette. The idea is when you mix all the colors, they all get darker. Now, this is kind of what my color palette is, but that's not entirely accurate. And there's a few reasons for that. So to understand how printing works, the colors are transparent and they're put on in layers. Paint and paint pigments don't function exactly that way. They can, depending on the colors and depending on your painting techniques. If your painting technique involves a lot of glazing, and you use a lot of transparent colors, and you wait for everything to dry, it really can function that way. I don't paint like that. I paint in a direct manner. It could be considered alla prima, but that's not entirely accurate, because alla prima means all in one sitting, and that's not really the case, but it's referred to as alla prima painting or direct painting. And that's not to say that I never use layers or I never use scumbling. It's just not how I do most of my painting. So CMYK wouldn't entirely work with how I paint. Not only that, but the CMYK palette for printing is also notorious for having a limited gamma range, meaning there's a lot of colors it can't reproduce. And it's very, very frustrating as someone who's worked in print in the past, trying to edit photos so that they will print correctly. But in order to get like really vibrant colors, they often use a lot of spot colors. So CMYK is great, but definitely not perfect. And then when you try and bring that into oils, it's definitely not perfect. Also, oil paint is a subtractive color system and also an additive color system. Now, I'm not 100% expert on this, so if I'm getting this slightly wrong, excuse me, but my understanding is the way that works is that oil paint, and to simplify it, is oil with particles of pigment suspended inside the oil. And so light does pass through that, not all of the light obviously, but a degree of it. And then it passes through and bounces back out. So there's an element of additive and subtractive with oil paint. More subtractive than additive, of course, but a degree of it. So when you take in all those aspects that I just mentioned, you see that CMYK isn't the best palette. Also, the other reason my palette is modified is there is no perfect cyan. So I don't use cyan, but I use phthalo blue. And I will talk about that in an upcoming video that highlights phthalo blue. The next video after this is going to highlight magenta, which I will talk about as well because I don't use magenta, I use permanent rose. And I'll discuss that some more in the next video. That's the idea for this week. Each painting is dedicated to a specific color, and I'll be talking about my palette and those colors specifically. So the ever disrespected yellow. There's so many types of yellow, but it's just yellow, whatever. I don't know why yellow gets so much disrespect. This painting clearly dedicated to yellow. So I'm going to be talking about which yellow I use, why, and so on, and how it interacts with other colors. I did use other colors in it. I was planning that when I made it, but I wanted to highlight and showcase the yellow. So for the yellow that I'm using in this case, I'm using bismuth yellow. I've used other yellows in the past. Specifically, I've used cadmium yellow light or cad yellow light, and I've used cad lemon. For a long time, cad lemon was my go-to, but I switched over to bismuth yellow recently. There's also Hansa yellow and Azo yellow, and there's also aerolite yellow. I think that's how you pronounce it. I think I've used some of those yellows in the past because I've used Winsor Newton's Winsor yellow. They're like name brand yellow, which I'm pretty sure is one of those or a mix of those. The aerolite yellow and the Hansa yellow. My understanding is they're not as light fast as the cadmiums and as bismuth. Also, they're a bit weaker. Not when they come out of the tube. They're actually extremely bright and I really like them. My understanding is they're a bit weaker when mixing and they're more transparent or translucent. My other colors are translucent, so I'm not opposed to using translucent colors. The issue is that overall yellow is a weak color in general. So using a yellow that's already translucent is not very appealing to me. The main reason I stay away from those colors is the light fast issue. I tried to not include anything in my palette that isn't very, very light fast. So the reason I moved over to bismuth yellow was partially because I was curious about the color because of Nicholas Uribe. He used to use it a lot. I wanted to see what it was. I'm also generally trying to reduce the harmful pigments as much as possible that I do use in my palette or in my painting. And when I compared bismuth yellow to cadmium yellow light or cadmium lemon, they're very, very close. And, you know, it really depends on the brand because each brand will make the same color with the same pigment code and it'll be slightly different in color or sometimes more than slightly different, which is, by the way, super frustrating. It makes buying paint without trying it extremely difficult and frustrating. That's a rant for another time. But yeah. All three of these colors are extremely close to each other, but the reason I decided to go with bismuth over the cads is because I felt like when mixing with the bismuth yellow, it retained more of its chroma, or, you know, to put it simply, it retained more yellow color versus the cadmiums, which seemed to lighten the mix, but they would lose a lot of that yellow comparatively. In this painting, you might notice that this yellow seems to lean a little green, and so does the lemon yellow. It leans a little green. Not really green, it's just cool. It's not a warm yellow. But this yellow is really, really good at riding that line where it can go warm or cool. And that applies to most of my palette. You know, there's a common palette that artists use, which is a split primary. The idea being that you have a cool yellow, a warm yellow, a cool red, a warm red, a cool blue, a warm blue. And the idea being that if you want a vibrant mix, you mix the two that are close to each other. So, you know, a warm yellow with a warm red, but if you want a desaturated color, you use the opposites. You know, that's oversimplification, but for the most part. My palette, most of the colors ride the line where you can push them into the cool or into the warm. So you'll notice that when I do mix in my rose color, it does warm up quite a bit. The reason a lot of this painting seems extra cool or more green than maybe normal is because of a few factors. The ground or the surface that I'm painting on is black, and I think that when it mixes optically with the yellow, it pulls it into the green. Also, my black is Mars black, and when it mixes with my yellow, I've noticed it tends to go a little towards the green. I haven't noticed it going very cool when I mix my black with white, but when I do mix it with the yellow, I do feel it go towards the green. And lastly, I'm using titanium white, which is a very cool white. So everything is pulling this yellow into the cooler colors, which push it from yellow to a yellow with a hint of green in it. But all it takes is a bit of rose to bring it all the way back into the warm yellows, which is what I did in this painting. I let the background be mostly cool, and then I warmed up the figure a lot to make her stand out more. And also because generally speaking, we all lean into the warm colors because we're all flesh underneath. I didn't want to make her normal human color. I wanted to keep it in the yellow hue because I was highlighting the yellow, but I didn't want this to be a monochrome specifically. That's why I did mix in other colors here, and I did highlight some of my other colors from my palette. I did push her hair a little too red in spots, and her eyes I don't think are that blue, but I wanted to push the cyan to show it off because I'm showing off my palette. That's the goal of this painting. As far as my palette goes, I do think that yellow has possibly caused me the most problems. And what I mean by that is I am not convinced that this yellow is the best primary yellow. I do think it's a better primary than cadmium yellow, yellow light, or lemon, but I'm not convinced that this is the best primary yellow. I'm still looking for other yellows. But yellow seems to be the most problematic color for a few reasons. One is a lot of yellows are not light fast. And then the other problem with yellow is that yellow is inherently a light color. There is no such thing as a dark yellow, really, right? This is one of those things that is difficult in painting. As you bring yellow down in color, at some point it starts to go into the orange realm, or if you desaturate it, it goes into a gray or greenish type of color. I think that is one of the bigger limitations to yellow and this primary yellow. I was looking at Indian yellow for a potential primary yellow. I've never used Indian yellow, I haven't had a chance to, and I probably won't at this point because what I learned about it. So original Indian yellow is a whole other story, I'm not even going to get into that, but the more modern Indian yellow generally uses PY83, but recently there have been some things that have come out indicating that PY83 is not a very light fast color. It gets really complicated and into the weeds because there's two versions of PY83. One is transparent and one is not transparent. The transparent one isn't light fast. The opaque version is light fast, supposedly. So you might ask, why not just use the opaque version? Well, my understanding is the opaque version isn't nearly as versatile or good in mixing, which makes sense because transparent colors generally mix better than opaque colors. And like I said, I don't know that Indian yellow, even the transparent one, is a good primary. I've never tested it. It looked like it potentially could be, but since it's not light fast, I'm not going to use it. I have been looking for other alternatives. If you know of alternatives and you're like, this is the yellow that you need, let me know in the comments. To be clear, when I say a primary yellow, what I'm looking for in a primary yellow, in any primary color, is doesn't have to be the primary color coming out of the tube. What I need it to do is I need it to be able to mix up and down in value and be able to hit those highs and be able to move into the warmer or cooler areas of the palette. So let me use the yellow, since we're talking about yellow, as an example. Let's say there's a yellow that comes out of the tube as a dark orange. You might look at that and be like, that's not a good primary, you know, it's a dark orange. You're looking for a primary yellow. This is true. But if you mix this theoretical color that I'm coming up with white, and it makes a lemon yellow, and you mix that color with cyan, maybe a little white added to it, and it makes a really vibrant green or teal. And if you mix it with rose or magenta and you make a really nice red and oranges, if it can do those things, that's what I'm looking for. That's the type of primary color I'm looking for. And while the yellow that I'm using seems to be the best option that I have been able to find. I'm always open to better options. So the search continues. It's hard to know sometimes because you can't test paints out. I mean, you can test paints out, it's just you have to buy them. I don't think oil paint is always as expensive as people make it out to be when you're talking about making paintings, but it is expensive. It's especially expensive if all you're doing is buying tubes of paint to try out. I'm still on the hunt for the perfect yellow. So far, this seems to be the best yellow, but if there's a better yellow out there, let me know. Talking about the CMYK palette overall, there is nothing wrong with using more colors. It's not like there's something virtuous to using a limited palette. There are advantages to using a limited palette, and there are disadvantages. One of the advantages that you get from using a limited palette, especially when using a CMYK palette like this, you get really good at color mixing over time because these colors are all very, very strong, very bright, and most things aren't nearly as bright or vibrant as the palette. And when you have such a limited palette, you have to get very good at mixing all of those very, very subtle things that you're painting. And when you have very bright, strong colors, and I'm going to get into that more in subsequent paintings, because some of these pigments, people have referred to them as bully pigments because they bully all the other colors. So when you have those pigments, you have to be very nuanced and really control your mixes. So you get really good at color mixing. The downside is you have to be very good at color mixing to use it. And it takes a while to get good at color mixing. And if you're not paying attention, you can easily mess up your mixes. I've done that many times. So there are definitely a lot of cons to using this type of palette. Anyways, that's all for today's painting. Keep an eye out for the subsequent paintings this week. I'll dive into more detail about using a limited CMYK color palette, more about the modifications I've made, why, the advantages and disadvantages, and all the ins and outs of such a palette. So stay tuned for those. If you want to talk more about art, you can join my Discord community or follow me on social media. I'll have the links below. If I didn't mention it before, this painting is a 9x12 oil painting on ABS. It is available on my website for the special price of $250. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on any videos. I wanted to say thank you all so much for your support. We have passed the 600 subscriber count, which is really cool. Also, I don't promote it, but I do have a mailing list, and I want to ask you all to sign up for it. I basically don't use it. I will at some point, but I will not spam you. The advantage of the mailing list is that you are not subject to the whims of the algorithm. I have missed people's posts in the past. I have missed people's announcements of the past. I've missed out on opportunities in the past because they were all relying on social media and the algorithms, and I missed crucial things in the past. So if you don't want to miss out on anything, sign up for my mailing list. I won't spam you. I barely ever use it, but when I have things to give away or when I have big announcements to make, that is the place where I will do it. Anyways, thank you all so much for being here. I hope you have an amazing week, and as always, happy painting.